She appeared at her own memorial, and the Duke fell silent. When she spoke the truth he feared, the chapel at Aldridge held the weight of silence as though it were stone. White flowers, lilies, and winter roses crowded the altar in such profusion that their perfume had become something almost suffocating, a sweetness that clung to the air like a prayer no one quite believed. Candlelight trembled against the high windows, casting shadows that seemed to mourn as much as the mourners themselves. Leora Crestwell was dead. The funeral notice had been published 3 weeks prior. The society papers had devoted themselves to elaborate eulogies of her tragical disappearance and untimely passing, though no body had ever been recovered. No grave existed, only this monument of flowers and whispered conjecture. The Reverend Ashford stood before the assembly, his voice carrying the weight of ceremonial prose. We commend her to the grace of the Almighty, though her earthly remains remain a mystery unto the heavens alone. From his place in the foremost pew, Corvin Aldridge, Duke of Aldridge, master of lands that stretched beyond the county's borders, did not weep. His hands rested upon his knees, gloved and motionless. His jaw was set with that particular rigidity that had become familiar to every corner of society, the composure of a man bearing a burden that society itself had imposed upon him. The whispers had been relentless. It was he who drove her away. It was his coldness, his refusal to acknowledge her worth. She fled his indifference and perished in the attempt. He had not defended himself. To defend oneself was to confess that the accusations had struck a nerve, that her absence had carved a wound into his very being. Lady Meridia Vaughan sat 3 rows behind, her countenance arranged in that expression of righteous sorrow which she wielded like a weapon. She had been among the first to suggest that Leora's disappearance reflected poorly upon the Duke's character, that a true gentleman would have prevented such a calamity. The insinuation had taken root in drawing rooms across London, spreading like ivy through aristocratic gardens. Mirabelle Hartwick stood near the east window, her small frame diminished by the grandiosity of the chapel. She alone knew the truth that had been confided to her in the weeks before Leora's disappearance, a truth so carefully guarded that she had nearly taken her own life keeping it. Her gloved hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The Reverend was concluding his meditation on the mysteries of divine providence when the chapel doors at the western end opened with a sound like the drawing of a long breath. Every head turned. It was the sort of movement that occurs in a room full of fashionable people when a breach in protocol is about to occur, not quite deliberate, yet inevitable. A woman stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a gown of cream muslin with an overlay of palest lilac silk, and her bearing was such that no one could mistake her for a servant or a late-arriving mourner seeking anonymity. She wore no bonnet. Her hair, unbound save for a ribbon of pale lavender, caught the winter light from the tall windows behind her. Her eyes were the color of pearled grey silk. "Pray forgive my intrusion," she said, and her voice, though soft, carried the peculiar quality of absolute certainty. "I have only just arrived from the country. I was unaware that my own memorial had been arranged." For an instant, a single crystalline instant, the chapel existed in absolute silence. Even the candles seemed to cease their flickering. The Reverend's mouth moved soundlessly. Lady Meridia's complexion shifted from pale to a mottled shade of displeasure. The assembled mourners, aunts, cousins, distant relations, society matrons, and curious hangers-on, sat as though suddenly carved from marble. Corvin rose to his feet. It was a small movement, yet it altered the entire atmosphere of the chapel. When the Duke of Aldridge rose, the room itself seemed to acknowledge his authority. He turned to face her, and in that turning something shifted in the depths of his grey-green eyes, something that might have been recognition or hope or the terrible acknowledgement of a truth long feared. "Miss Crestwell," he said, and his voice carried the weight of carefully measured control. "The hour is late and this gathering was arranged as a memorial to your memory. Perhaps you have mistaken the occasion for something else entirely." "I have mistaken nothing, Your Grace," Leora replied, and she stepped forward into the chapel proper, her footsteps audible against the stone floor. "I am quite decidedly alive, and I have come to speak a truth that was bound in silence too long." The envelope she carried, cream-colored, sealed with wax that had been carefully broken, caught the candlelight as she held it forth. "This letter," she continued, "was written the night before I left London. It was addressed to you, Your Grace. It contains words that were never meant to remain unspoken." Mirabelle made a small sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. Lady Meridia rose from her seat, her voice sharp as a blade. "This is most irregular, Miss Crestwell. A young woman, unchaperoned, appearing in a place of mourning with cryptic proclamations. The impropriety is almost beyond measure." Leora's gaze turned toward Lady Meridia with a gentleness that somehow made the rebuke more cutting than any harshness could have achieved. "Impropriety," she said softly, "is a matter of perspective, madam. I have learned, in my months of silence, that the greatest impropriety of all is the permission of a lie to flourish when truth stands at the threshold, waiting." She turned again to Corvin, and their eyes met, two souls regarding one another across a chasm of misunderstanding and grief. "Your Grace," she said, "I have not come to disrupt your mourning. I have come to end it." And in that moment, the Duke of Aldridge, master of ancient estates and keeper of careful silences, found that he could not form a single word in response. The chapel remained suspended in that peculiar state of social vertigo, where propriety struggles against curiosity, and truth begins its dangerous work of unraveling the careful fabric of public assumption. The Reverend, uncertain whether to conclude the service or permit this extraordinary interruption, looked toward the Duke for guidance. Corvin, however, seemed incapable of offering any instruction whatsoever. He remained standing, his dark eyes fixed upon Leora's face, as though attempting to discern whether she was a vision summoned by his own guilt, or whether she was indeed flesh and blood, real, breathing, and impossibly alive. "If you would permit me," Leora said, her voice carrying that same unshakable composure, "I should like to speak before this assembly, for it was before the assembly that judgment was rendered upon my character. It is therefore before the assembly that truth must be restored." Lady Meridia made a small noise of protest. "Miss Crestwell, whatever the circumstances of your mysterious absence, a funeral chapel is hardly the proper venue for explanations." The impropriety, Leora interrupted gently, "began long before I departed London, madam, and it did not originate with me. A shift occurred then, subtle but unmistakable, in the atmosphere of the chapel. Those assembled began to sense that this was no nervous dissolution of a confused young woman, but rather the calculated emergence of someone who had chosen her moment with extraordinary precision." Mirabelle stepped forward, her small frame suddenly seeming to contain an immense courage. "Miss Crestwell speaks truth," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can attest to her words. I have known the circumstances that necessitated her departure, and I have guarded them in silence as she required." "Then you are complicit in whatever deception has occurred," Lady Meridia declared, her righteousness gathering itself like storm clouds. Corvin's hand rose in a gesture of unmistakable authority. "Lady Meridia," he said, and the quietness of his tone somehow made the command more absolute, "I find that I wish to hear what Miss Crestwell has come to tell us." Surely that is not an unreasonable request. There was something in the way he spoke, a certain tender ferocity, that caused Lady Meridia to settle back into her seat, though her expression remained one of wounded indignation. Leora moved toward the altar, the pale fabric of her gown catching the candlelight like captured moonlight. She held the envelope before her with both hands, as one might hold a sacred text. "Before I departed London," she began, "I was made the subject of certain insinuations. It was suggested that I was, how shall I phrase it delicately, that I was seeking an advantageous connection through means that society would deem improper. It was further suggested that my attentions were unwelcome, that my presence was burdensome." Her eyes, steady and luminous, turned toward Corvin. "These insinuations were spread by those who believed themselves guardians of propriety, yet they possessed no knowledge of the truth, no knowledge whatsoever." "And what is this truth?" a distant relation called out, one of those hangers-on who attended funerals primarily for the opportunity to gather gossip. Leora opened the envelope with deliberate care. The wax seal, long since broken by her own hand, released a whisper of aged paper. "This letter," she said, "was written to inform His Grace of a matter of grave personal consequence, a matter which I believed then and believe now required his knowledge and his intervention." She unfolded the pages, and her voice, when she resumed speaking, carried a quality of such profound sincerity that even Lady Meridia fell silent. "I wrote to him of my father's circumstances, of his failing health, and of certain financial entanglements that threatened not merely our family's reputation, but the very solvency of our household. I wrote to him because—" She paused, gathering herself, "because I believed that the respect which he had shown to my father's botanical work might extend to a desire to assist in a moment of crisis." A murmur rippled through the chapel, not of scandal now, but of dawning comprehension. "You fled," Corvin said quietly, "to protect your family." "I fled," Leora corrected, "because I could not bear to remain in a place where my motives were questioned, where the offer of assistance would be misconstrued as mercenary ambition, and where remaining would only deepen the shadow cast upon those whom I loved." She looked directly at him then, and there was in her gaze a question that seemed to reach far beyond the immediate circumstances of the chapel and this strange reunion. "I departed believing that absence would silence the whispers. I believed that if I removed myself from London's view, society would turn its attention to other matters, and my family might be spared further scrutiny. And instead," Corvin said slowly, "your absence was interpreted as guilt. The narrative was constructed not around truth, but around assumption." "Indeed," Leora confirmed, "and it is that narrative which I have come to refute, not through defiance, but through the presentation of facts. My father is no longer in financial distress. I have secured employment in the household of a respectable family in Kent, and through diligent labor and careful economies, I have ensured his recovery." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an undertone of something that might have been sorrow, or might have been love, too long contained. "But I learned in my absence that the cost of silence was nearly as grievous as the whispers themselves. Silence allowed the falsehood to flourish. It permitted those who might have defended my character to remain uncertain of its truth. And most significantly, it deprived the Duke of Aldridge of the knowledge he had rightfully deserved." The envelope hung between them, pages still unfolded, like a bridge constructed of words and time and the fragile hope that truth, however late, might yet mend what assumption had broken. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice trembled with the weight of years of unspoken devotion, "I have come to restore what was taken. Not my reputation, for that matters little now, but your peace and the truth." The silence that followed Leora's declaration was not the silence of shock, but rather the silence of a room full of people grappling with the sudden and irrevocable dismantling of everything they had assumed to be true. The white flowers seemed to lean inward, as though the chapel itself were listening. Lady Meridia rose again, her voice acquiring a thin, cutting edge. "This is all very affecting, Miss Crestwell, but it remains entirely circumstantial. You produce a letter, claim hardship, and expect that we shall simply accept your narrative as truth. The fact remains that you disappeared without proper notice, without explanation to those who had no right to demand one," Leora said, and for the first time there was steel beneath her gentleness. "A young woman is not obligated to announce her movements to society, madam, nor to justify her choices to those who have already condemned her without evidence." Heir cousin of the Duke's, Lord Harrington, a man of some reputation for decency, rose and offered his hand to Leora. "Miss Crestwell, I am certain that we all comprehend the difficult circumstances which necessitated your action, however unorthodox they may have appeared. You have returned, you have offered explanation, and I, for one, should like to believe that we might now move forward with restored understanding." It was an olive branch, extended with sincerity, but it was also a plea for everyone to accept the explanation and return to the comfortable numbness of social normalcy. Corvin, however, did not appear satisfied with this resolution. He stepped down from his place and approached Leora with a deliberation that caused every person in the chapel to hold their breath. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant for her ears alone, yet the intimacy of the tone somehow made it audible to all. "Why did you not permit me to read this letter at the time? Why did you not trust me with the knowledge of your father's circumstances?" Leora's eyes, those grey, luminous eyes, met his with an expression of such profound sadness that it seemed to encompass not merely her own sorrow, but something far larger and more universal. "Because," she said softly, "I had overheard a conversation between Lady Meridia and her associates, not a fortnight before I wrote the letter. They were discussing your generosity toward my father's botanical work, and Lady Meridia expressed her belief that you were doing so to secure a pathway to my companionship, that your attentions were calculated to create an obligation which I would feel compelled to repay through acceptance of an offer that you might in due course extend." A sharp intake of breath from several quarters indicated that this was precisely the sort of gossip that had circulated throughout fashionable drawing rooms. "Lady Meridia further suggested," Leora continued, "that should I have any sense whatsoever, I would interpret your kindnesses as a contract of sorts, that I should prepare myself to accept a proposal that would elevate my standing considerably, provided I did not prove to be an embarrassment to the Aldridge name." "Precisely." Lady Meridia interjected, her voice rising. "It was a truth plainly stated. The Duke was offering you a route to respectability." "The Duke was offering my father assistance," Leora said, turning toward the assembled company. "And in doing so, he was acting as a man of principle and compassion acts. That society chose to interpret this as mercenary calculation is a reflection upon society, not upon his grace." She turned back to Corvin, and her voice softened to something almost unbearably tender. "I could not write to you knowing that my request for aid would be viewed, by you, by myself, by all of society, as an attempt to secure a response to an unspoken question. I could not place you in a position where kindness was forced to masquerade as sentiment, or where genuine compassion was twisted into the foundation of an obligation. So you removed yourself entirely," Corvin said, and there was in his tone a recognition of something he had not permitted himself to acknowledge before. "You sacrificed your place in society, your reputation, your comfort, all to preserve the possibility that any aid I offered would be untainted by the suggestion that I offered it with ulterior motive." "I believed it the most honorable course," Leora replied. "And was it?" he asked. And the question seemed to contain within it all the loneliness of the past months, all the nights he had spent in this vast house, wondering what he had done to drive her away, all the careful construction of indifference he had maintained before society to mask the erosion of his own heart. Leora did not answer immediately. Instead, she extended the unfolded letter toward him, not to the assemblage, but specifically to him. "Your Grace," she said, "whatever I believe to be honorable has cost us both dearly. I have come to understand that silence, however well-intentioned, is its own form of deception. This letter contains words I wrote in crisis, words I believed could not be safely delivered. But they are words you deserve to read, not before this assembly, but in private, in whatever place and whatever time you deem appropriate." Corvin reached out and took the letter with a hand that trembled slightly, a gesture so human, so vulnerable, that it seemed to strip away every carefully maintained facade he had constructed. The chapel erupted then in a symphony of sound, whispered consultations, Lady Meridia's indignant protests, the rustling of skirts and programs as people attempted to process what was occurring before them. But Corvin heard none of it. His eyes remained fixed upon Leora's face, and in that gaze there was recognition of something that transcended the normal boundaries of courtship and propriety, recognition of a kindred spirit, of a soul that had chosen suffering rather than compromise, and of a love that had been patient enough to wait, honest enough to return, and brave enough to speak truth in a room full of those who preferred comfortable falsehoods. "I should like to know," he said quietly, "the content of this letter." "Not here, not now, but soon, Miss Crestwell. Very soon indeed." The chapel had begun to empty as twilight descended upon the grounds of Aldridge House, though the departure of the mourners seemed less an orderly conclusion and more a reluctant exodus, prompted by the dawning realization that the spectacle had concluded and that further presence would yield no additional revelations. Lady Meridia departed with the bearing of one who had been personally affronted by truth itself, her carriage wheels grinding against the gravel pathway with an aggression that spoke volumes regarding her displeasure. The Reverend Ashford lingered briefly to offer his bewilderment to Corvin in the form of ecclesiastical platitudes, before departing with the observation that the Lord moved in mysterious ways and that perhaps this reunion was itself a form of divine intervention. Lord Harrington had attempted to speak privately with Leora, but Mirabelle had gently drawn her away, leaving him to bow respectfully and withdraw. Now, in the drawing-room of Aldridge House, a space of considerable grandeur, with walls the colour of deep forest green and furnishings that spoke of generations of careful curation, Leora stood near the great window that overlooked the winter gardens. The letter remained in Corvin's possession. He had retired to his library to read it, and she had been left in the company of Mirabelle, who sat upon a settee with an expression of cautious optimism that barely concealed her anxiety. "You should not have spoken so boldly before the entire assembly," Mirabelle said, though her voice carried affection rather than rebuke. "The impropriety will follow you relentlessly now. Society will have opinions, vicious opinions, regarding your reappearance." "Society has always had opinions regarding me," Leora replied, and there was in her tone a weariness that suggested she had made peace with this immutable truth. "Those opinions, however, were constructed upon falsehood. I have at least restored the possibility of alternative understanding. Whether society chooses to embrace that understanding is beyond my control." She turned from the window, and the firelight caught the pearlescent quality of her eyes. "Mirabelle, I have spent months in solitude, working in a respectable household, engaging in labor that my former life would have deemed unsuitable, and in that solitude, I learned something precious, that the judgment of society carries weight only if one permits oneself to bear it." Mirabelle rose and took her friend's hands. "And the Duke? What of your feelings regarding his grace?" Leora's composure, which had remained steadfast throughout the chapel proceedings, seemed to fracture slightly. A faint color rose to her cheeks, and her gaze shifted downward. "My feelings regarding the Duke," she said softly, "are irrelevant. I came not to restore my own peace, but to restore his. I came to ensure that he should not carry forward the burden of guilt for circumstances he could not have prevented. Whether he reads this letter with understanding or with indifference is a matter I must accept." "You are not a very convincing dissembler," Mirabelle observed gently. "I have known you since childhood, Leora. I have watched you maintain composure through countless social trials. Yet when you look upon his grace, something shifts in your countenance, a vulnerability that you permit no one else to witness." Before Leora could formulate a response to this too accurate observation, the drawing-room doors opened. Corvin stood in the threshold, the letter still held in his hands, though it had been carefully folded once more. His expression was difficult to pass, not angry certainly, but neither was it entirely composed. There was in his grey-green eyes an intensity that seemed to burn with barely restrained emotion. "Mirabelle," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the noble house, "I should like to speak privately with Miss Crestwell. Might I impose upon your kindness to retire to the library for a brief interval? I believe you will find the Botanical Quarterly there. Your fascination with the study of ferns has been noted." Mirabelle, recognizing the courtesy of the dismissal despite its formulaic phrasing, rose with alacrity. She paused only to squeeze Leora's hand briefly, her expression suggesting both hope and a certain maternal concern, before departing the drawing-room. For a moment after Mirabelle's absence, neither Corvin nor Leora spoke. The fire crackled and the winter wind whispered against the tall windows, and between them stretched an expanse of carefully maintained distance that had been built over months of misunderstanding and reinforced by pride on both sides. "Your letter," Corvin began at last, and his voice carried the quality of someone who is choosing each word with extraordinary deliberation, "contains words of such extraordinary delicacy that I confess myself bewildered as to how I failed to comprehend your circumstances at the time. You wrote of your father's situation with a clarity that anyone possessed of reasonable understanding should have perceived. And yet society, in its infinite wisdom, chose to interpret your reticence as evidence of mercenary calculation." He moved further into the drawing-room, his tall frame seeming to command the space with an ease that spoke of long habituation to authority. "You wrote, furthermore, of your concerns regarding my motivations in assisting your father, and in doing so, you demonstrated a delicacy of feeling that I find myself entirely unprepared to address adequately." Leora's hands had clasped together, and her knuckles had gone white beneath her gloves. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I trust that the letter has provided sufficient explanation for my actions. I have sought only to restore clarity to a situation that was obscured by misunderstanding." "Clarity," he repeated, and there was something almost amused in his tone, though the amusement carried an undercurrent of profound emotion. "Miss Crestwell, you present to me a letter in which you confess to a consciousness of your own heart that you did not permit yourself to acknowledge openly. You speak of concerns regarding my regard, of fears that kindness might be misconstrued as obligation, of a desire to preserve the integrity of such assistance as I might offer. And you call this restoration of clarity." He paused before her, and in the firelight his features seemed to shift between shadow and illumination, a study in the contradictions of strength and vulnerability. "What I perceive in this letter," he continued, "is a woman of such profound honor that she chose exile rather than permit another soul to suffer the consequences of her presence. And that, Miss Crestwell, is not a matter of clarity, it is a matter of courage." The silence that followed seemed to carry weight, as though the very air between them had become substantial with unspoken truth. "I have, over the past months," Corvin said quietly, "been a man diminished by the belief that I had failed you. Your reappearance has not restored my peace. It has instead awakened within me the understanding that my own suffering pales in comparison to the sacrifice you undertook, and that recognition is not a relief, Miss Crestwell. It is a burden of an entirely different nature." The drawing-room had grown dim as the evening progressed, and a servant had entered quietly to light the candelabras, casting the space in that particular quality of golden illumination that transforms interiors into something approaching the sacred. Leora remained standing, her posture erect, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Corvin had moved toward the window, his silhouette outlined against the darkening landscape beyond. "You speak of burden, Your Grace," Leora said, and her voice carried a steadiness that seemed constructed through considerable effort. "Yet I must confess that I do not comprehend the source of this burden. The letter was written in a moment of crisis. It contained explanations of circumstance, not declarations of—" "Of what?" Corvin interrupted, turning to face her fully. "Of feeling, of regard, of the particular quality of affection that one soul holds for another, when propriety forbids any articulation of such regard." Leora's breath caught audibly. The color that had previously risen to her cheeks now drained away entirely, leaving her complexion as pale as the muslin of her gown. "The letter," Corvin continued, advancing slowly into the more brightly illuminated center of the room, "contains within its carefully measured phrases a documentation of your father's financial circumstances, certainly, but it contains, additionally, evidence of something far more profound, evidence of a consciousness that extended beyond familial obligation to encompass a concern for my own reputation and standing. You feared, Miss Crestwell, that any acceptance of your request for assistance would place me in a position of social vulnerability. You feared, furthermore, that I might interpret such a request as an opening for propositions that you had not authorized." He paused, and when he resumed speaking, his voice had taken on a quality of almost unbearable tenderness. "And in fearing these things, in protecting me from the very interpretation that society had already begun to construct, you revealed the true content of your heart far more completely than any explicit declaration could have achieved." Leora turned away, moving toward the window where Corvin had previously stood. The gardens beyond were now nearly invisible, the landscape reduced to shadows and the faint gleam of frost-covered stone. Her reflection in the glass was ghost-like, insubstantial. "What you are suggesting, Your Grace," she said quietly, "is that I should have spoken plainly rather than protecting you through absence. Yet had I remained in London and spoken plainly, would not society have interpreted such plainness as precisely the mercenary calculation that Lady Meridia had insinuated? Would not my words have been twisted into evidence of calculation rather than accepted as testimony to genuine feeling?" "Perhaps," Corvin acknowledged, and there was in his voice no accusation, only a kind of weary recognition of the impossible position in which she had been placed. "And perhaps in another era or another society, the choice you made would have been the only honorable choice available to you. But I would ask you to consider, Miss Crestwell, what the cost of that choice has been, not merely to yourself, but to others." He moved to the hearth and stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic posture he adopted when bearing weight. "In the months following your departure, I was compelled to maintain an appearance of indifference toward your absence. To express concern would have been to validate society's insinuation that my previous kindnesses had been motivated by personal interest. To mourn you openly would have been to provide Lady Meridia with exactly the evidence she required to confirm her interpretation of events. And so I remained silent, and in my silence I allowed the narrative of your presumed demise to flourish unchallenged. But you are not responsible for society's narrative, Your Grace," Leora protested, turning from the window to face him once more. "Society constructs its narratives independent of any truth we might offer it. The responsibility for falsehood rests not with those who remain silent, but with those who speak lies." "And yet," Corvin said, and something in his expression seemed to shift, something that moved from intellectual debate into emotional territory, "silence can itself be a form of betrayal. When we remain silent in the face of calumny, we permit that calumny to define reality. We grant it authority that it has no right to possess." He withdrew the letter from his waistcoat pocket, where he had carried it throughout the evening. The candlelight caught the fold creases, the slight wear upon the paper that suggested it had been read not once but multiple times. "I have read this letter perhaps a dozen times since leaving the chapel," he said softly, "and each time I read it, I find new evidence of your virtue, of your concern for my standing, of your fear that your own presence might compromise my honor. And each time I read it, I find myself consumed by rage, not toward you but toward a society that would place a woman of such profound character in a position where her only recourse was to efface herself entirely from the world she inhabited." He moved toward her then, with a deliberation that suggested this was a crossing of an important threshold. "You came back, Miss Crestwell, not to secure your own redemption, but to ensure that I should not carry forward a false narrative regarding your departure. That was an act of extraordinary grace, and I find that I am not content to permit that grace to go unacknowledged." His hand extended toward her, not in the casual manner of social greeting, but with a tenderness that suggested he was offering her something far more significant than courtesy. "I would like to know," he said, and his voice carried a vulnerability that seemed to strip away every protective layer he had carefully constructed, "whether the woman who wrote this letter might possibly permit the man who receives it to demonstrate, through action rather than assumption, the depth of his own regard, not as obligation, not as social necessity, but as the genuine response of one heart to the extraordinary courage of another." Leora's gloved hand rose to meet his, and the moment of contact, leather against leather, yet somehow achieving an intimacy that transcended physical barriers, seemed to contain within it all the longing of months of separation, and the fragile hope that truth, however costly, might yet provide foundation for something durable and genuine. The drawing room seemed to contract around them in that moment, the candlelight creating an intimate circle of golden warmth that isolated them from the rest of the great house. Leora's hand remained within Corvin's grasp, and neither seemed inclined to break the contact that had become, in that instant, a form of communication far more eloquent than words. "Your Grace," Leora began, though her voice wavered slightly, "I must confess that I do not know how to proceed from this juncture. The circumstances in which we find ourselves are unprecedented. Society will inevitably construct narratives regarding this reunion, and those narratives will not be charitable. You are the Duke of Aldridge, a man whose station carries expectations of appropriate conduct. My reappearance will be viewed as an intrusion into your grief, not as a restoration of truth." Corvin drew her hand gently closer until she stood at a distance from him that would have been scandalously intimate had they been observed by any member of society. Yet in the privacy of the drawing room, with only the fire and the gathering darkness as witnesses, it felt not improper, but rather the most natural configuration of space that two souls might occupy. "Miss Crestwell," he said, and there was in his tone a quality of barely restrained emotion, "I have spent the better part of my life constructing a facade, a presentation of the Duke of Aldridge that society expects and requires. That facade has permitted me to function within the aristocratic sphere without revealing the vulnerabilities that lie beneath. Yet when you appeared in the chapel, when you spoke with such extraordinary courage, I found that facade crumbling with remarkable rapidity." He paused, and his grip upon her hand tightened fractionally. "Over the months following your departure, I engaged in extensive analysis of my own conduct. I examined every interaction, every gesture, every moment of conversation in which we had encountered one another, and I came to understand something that society in its infinite wisdom had attempted to prevent me from acknowledging." "And what is that, Your Grace?" Leora asked, though her voice suggested she already possessed some inkling of his meaning. "That you had become," he said quietly, "the center around which my consciousness orbited, that your absence did not diminish this truth, but rather illuminated it with extraordinary clarity. Every action I undertook, I found myself considering how it might affect you. Every moment of solitude became a meditation upon whether you were suffering, whether you were safe, whether you remained alive, or had truly succumbed to whatever fate had removed you from London." He lifted her hand to his lips with a gesture so tender that it seemed to partake of reverence rather than mere courtship. "The letter you wrote contained explanations of circumstance, but what it conveyed to me upon reading was the knowledge that you possessed such concern for my standing, such consciousness of the implications of your own presence, that you were willing to sacrifice everything, your reputation, your position in society, your own comfort and security, to preserve the integrity of my character." "That was not sacrifice, Your Grace," Leora protested gently. "It was merely honorable conduct." "It was far more than that," Corvin replied, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that suggested he was reading the depths of her soul. "It was love, Miss Crestwell, expressed not through words or conventional gestures, but through action, through the difficult choice to remove yourself rather than permit another soul to suffer the consequences of association with you. That is the truest form of love, and I confess that I have spent months contemplating whether I possessed the courage to acknowledge my own corresponding feelings." The silence that followed seemed to contain the weight of revelation, of words long unspoken finally achieving utterance. "I must ask you something," Corvin continued, "and I require that you answer with absolute honesty. When you departed London, when you removed yourself from society with such deliberation, was it primarily motivated by concern for your father's circumstances, or was there some component, however small, of your decision that stemmed from a desire to preserve distance between yourself and me?" Leora's gaze shifted downward, and she seemed to be engaging in some internal struggle between confession and continued guardedness. "If I answer that question truthfully," she said at last, "I must confess that I am uncertain of my own motivations. The two elements were intertwined so thoroughly that I could not separate them. Yes, my father required assistance, but there was also—" She paused and took a breath that seemed to require considerable effort. "There was also a recognition that your kindnesses toward him were creating expectations within society regarding my future. Expectations that I could not permit myself to fulfill, because to do so would have been to accept love as though it were merely currency in a transaction." She raised her eyes to meet his, and in that gaze there was vulnerability and courage intermixed. "And yes," she continued, "there was also a component of self-preservation. I could not remain in proximity to you, knowing that you occupied a sphere of existence into which I could not genuinely ascend, without experiencing the diminishment of my own character. Better to remove myself entirely than to remain as a constant reminder of my own inadequacy." "Your own inadequacy?" Corvin repeated, and there was something almost fierce in his response. "Miss Crestwell, you possess qualities that I have encountered in no other person in my entire existence. Your moral clarity, your courage, your capacity for selflessness, these are not inadequacies. They are distinctions that elevate you far above the trivial concerns that occupy the minds of most members of society." He drew her hand once more to his chest, placing it directly over his heart. "What I am endeavoring to convey to you is that the Duke of Aldridge, the title, the estates, the expectations and obligations that come with the name, these are merely the external circumstances of my existence. But the man beneath that title, the soul that inhabits this body, has been transformed entirely by your presence and subsequently by your absence. I do not require your elevation to my station. I require only the knowledge that you will permit me to share in your extraordinary journey, and that you will accept my regard as genuine rather than motivated by social calculation." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something approaching a whisper. "Tell me, Miss Leora, is there any possibility that the woman who wrote this letter might someday permit the man who received it to speak of marriage not as transaction, but as the union of two souls who have recognized in each other something approaching completion? The night had transformed into something neither day nor night, that peculiar liminal space that exists in the hours before dawn, when the world seems suspended between darkness and illumination." Leora and Corvin remained in the drawing room, though the candles had burned lower, and the fire had been replenished twice by servants who entered with the discretion of those trained to permit their employers privacy while maintaining the proprieties of household management. They had not touched beyond that initial grasp of hands, yet the distance between them seemed to have collapsed into something far more intimate than physical proximity could achieve. Leora sat upon the settee, no longer standing in that posture of formal presentation, while Corvin occupied the chair nearest to her, his entire being oriented toward the woman before him with an attentiveness that suggested she contained the entirety of his consciousness. "You have not answered my question," he said, and there was in his tone a gentleness that somehow made the insistence more compelling than any demand could have achieved. Leora's hands lay folded in her lap, and she appeared to be engaged in some profound internal debate, a struggle between the dictates of propriety and the demands of her own heart. "If I answer affirmatively to your question," she said at last, "I commit myself to a course that will expose us both to considerable scrutiny and judgment. Society will inevitably construct narratives regarding my reappearance and your subsequent proposal, narratives that will not be charitable. There are those who will suggest that I orchestrated the entire disappearance as an elaborate stratagem to secure your proposal. Others will suggest that you have been manipulated by a woman of questionable character. The whispers will be relentless, and they will extend not merely to us but to our families and to all those associated with us." "I am aware of these probabilities," Corvin replied, and his voice carried the weight of considered judgment. "And I confess that I do not regard them as obstacles. I regard them as tests of the authenticity of what we feel for one another. If our regard cannot withstand the judgment of society, then it is not worthy of preservation. But I am convinced based upon the testimony of your actions, your words, and the extraordinary courage you have demonstrated, that our regard can withstand far more formidable assaults than social disapproval." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky. The gardens of Aldridge, which had been rendered invisible by darkness, were beginning to emerge from shadow, a resurrection of form and color that paralleled in some manner the resurrection of hope that had occurred within that drawing-room. "I should like to make a proposal," Corvin continued. "Not the proposal of marriage, though that remains foremost in my intention, but a proposal regarding the manner in which we shall proceed. I suggest that we permit a period of courtship, a public courtship, conducted with complete transparency and in full view of society. During this period, we shall permit society to observe us together, to witness the authenticity of our regard for one another, and to construct narratives that are grounded in observable fact rather than in conjecture." "A public courtship," Leora repeated, and there was in her voice something approaching wonder. "Your Grace, you understand that such a course would expose me to extraordinary judgment, that there are those who will never accept the narrative of my innocence, regardless of how transparently I conduct myself." "I understand perfectly," Corvin confirmed, turning from the window to face her directly. "And I confess that I do not propose this course because I believe it will silence society's whispers. Society's whispers are eternal and impervious to the influence of mere truth. I propose this course because I believe that you deserve to be courted openly, publicly, with all the ceremonies and attentions that your station will eventually permit. And furthermore, I believe that an open courtship will provide irrefutable evidence of the genuine nature of our regard and will provide foundation for the defense of our union against those who attempt to diminish or question it." Leora rose from the settee, and she moved toward him with a deliberation that suggested she was crossing some internal threshold. "Your Grace," she said, "if I agree to this proposal, I must do so understanding that I am accepting not merely a courtship, but a reconstruction of my entire position within society. I am accepting the role of a woman who has returned from absence and who is being courted by a man of considerable standing. That position will require of me constant vigilance regarding my conduct, constant consciousness of how my actions will be interpreted, constant awareness of the forces arrayed against my acceptance." "You are correct," Corvin acknowledged, "and I understand that this places upon you a burden that is neither insignificant nor entirely fair. But I would ask you to consider whether that burden is truly more formidable than the burden you have already borne, the burden of silence, of separation, of maintaining a distance that was necessary for honor, but devastating for the soul." He extended his hand to her once more, and in the pale light of approaching dawn, his features seemed to carry a clarity that suggested some essential truth had been illuminated. "Miss Leora," he said, and his voice carried a quality of absolute sincerity, "permit me to court you. Permit me to demonstrate to society, and more importantly to yourself, that your return has not been a mistake, that your courage has been witnessed and honored, and that there exists at least one soul in this world who comprehends the extraordinary nature of your character." Leora's hand rose to meet his, and in that moment, as the dawn light touched her face, something shifted in her expression, a releasing of the tension that had been maintained for so long, a surrender to the possibility that perhaps her own happiness was not a betrayal of virtue, but rather its culmination. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I accept the courtship and all of its attendant risks and exposures. I accept the judgment of society, and I accept the burden of proving my worth through every action and every moment of observable conduct. And I do so because I have come to understand that to continue protecting you through distance would be a continuation of the very deception that I have devoted myself to overcoming." The dawn light continued to strengthen, and in that increasing illumination, the drawing room seemed to be witnessing something approaching consecration, the sanctification of a choice that had cost both of them dearly, and that would require of them a courage that extended far beyond the boundaries of the merely personal. The announcement of the forthcoming courtship of the Duke of Aldridge and Miss Leora Crestwell appeared in the society pages of every major publication within the span of a single week. The phrasing was carefully constructed to suggest a reconnection rather than a commencement, a renewal of acquaintance, and a mutual recognition of esteem. Yet the underlying message was unmistakable. The Duke had chosen, and society was expected to acknowledge that choice with appropriate grace. The response was precisely as complex and divided as might have been anticipated. On one side stood those members of the aristocracy who recognized in this courtship an act of courage, who perceived in Leora's reappearance an opportunity to demonstrate their own magnanimity, and who proceeded to extend invitations with the enthusiasm of those eager to be counted among the enlightened. On the other side stood Lady Meridia and her increasingly desperate circle, who doubled their efforts to construct alternative narratives, spreading insinuations with the persistence of those for whom the dissolution of their carefully constructed moral certainties represented an existential threat. Yet what emerged most powerfully over the weeks that followed was a third response, one that came not from the aristocratic elite, but from those members of society whose own positions were precarious, whose own characters had been subject to judgment and misinterpretation, and who recognized in Leora's example a profound statement about the possibility of redemption and the triumph of truth over calumny. The first public appearance of Corvin and Leora together occurred at the opening of a charitable exhibition benefiting the advancement of botanical science, an institution that had been founded with the assistance of Leora's late father, and that had been championed by Corvin for several years preceding. The choice of venue was not accidental. It was, instead, a deliberate positioning that suggested their courtship was grounded in shared values and mutual intellectual respect, rather than in merely romantic sentiment. Leora wore a gown of exceptional beauty, pale silver with an overlay of the most delicate lavender silk, a palette that seemed to shimmer between colors in the gaslight of the exhibition hall. Her hair was arranged with simple elegance, secured with a ribbon of the same lavender hue, and from her wrist hung a small reticule embroidered with botanical motifs that had belonged to her father. The message conveyed was one of connection to her family, to the advancement of knowledge, to the humble origins that had shaped her character. Corvin wore the dark formal dress expected of a man of his station, but he had chosen to wear a pin in the lapel of his coat, a small silver botanical leaf that matched a pendant Leora wore at her throat. It was a gesture subtle enough to escape the notice of those not observing closely, yet unmistakable in its meaning to those who understood its significance. They were, in some profound sense, united in their values and their vision of what their union might accomplish. The moment they entered the exhibition hall together, the assemblage seemed to divide into two clearly defined groups. Those who had chosen to extend their support moved forward with warmth and genuine interest, engaging both Leora and Corvin in conversation, inquiring about future plans, demonstrating through their conduct that they had accepted the narrative of Leora's return and redemption. Lady Meridia and her associates, by contrast, withdrew to the far corner of the hall, their posture suggesting wounded dignity rather than genuine disapproval. It was a retreat so obvious, so deliberate, that it actually served to undermine their position far more effectively than overt opposition could have achieved. Those observing recognized in their withdrawal an acknowledgement that their position had been rendered untenable by the weight of circumstance and truth. Leora moved through the exhibition with a composure that was nothing short of extraordinary. She examined the displays with genuine interest, posed intelligent questions to the curators, and conducted herself in a manner that demonstrated, through every gesture and every moment of observable conduct, that she was precisely the woman that Corvin had presented her to be, cultured, thoughtful, virtuous, and entirely deserving of the regard in which he held her. At one juncture, an elderly gentleman, the Marquis of Thornbury, a man whose own reputation had weathered considerable scandal in his youth, approached Corvin privately and offered his observations. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I have observed society's machinations for more than 50 years, and I can assure you that what you have accomplished here is remarkable. The young lady has conducted herself with such extraordinary grace that even those predisposed toward judgment find themselves unable to locate genuine fault in her conduct. You have, through the simplicity of your public commitment to her, accomplished what argument and explanation alone could never achieve." Corvin accepted the compliment with the graciousness of one whose confidence in his chosen course had been validated by external observation. Yet privately, he harbored no illusions regarding the permanence of society's acceptance. He understood that Leora would continue to face scrutiny, that there would be those who never fully accepted her narrative, and that her position within the aristocratic sphere would forever remain somewhat contingent upon his own protection and advocacy. But as he watched her across the exhibition hall, conversing with genuine interest regarding a specimen of rare orchid, he recognized that such contingency was, in fact, the condition of nearly all human relationships. that no one possessed absolute security, and that the attempt to achieve such security through isolation and silence was itself a form of diminishment. The exhibition concluded, and as he escorted Leora toward their carriage, he caught her hand and drew her attention briefly away from the servants and observers surrounding them. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, and there was in his voice such absolute sincerity that Leora felt something within her chest expand with a joy that transcended the merely personal. "You conducted yourself with such grace and such courage that I found myself moved to something approaching reverence." "I merely behaved as I believe myself to be," Leora replied softly. "If that behavior has been perceived as admirable, then perhaps society's perception of me has been transformed not by any performance on my part, but by a revelation of truth that was previously obscured." 3 weeks into the formal courtship, Corvin commissioned a calligrapher of considerable renown to create a transcription of Leora's original letter. The letter itself, precious for the testimony it contained and for the circumstances of its composition, was deemed too fragile to circulate. Yet Corvin had conceived the notion that a beautifully executed transcription, preserved and available for examination by those who possessed legitimate interest, might serve to further establish the historical record of events and to provide irrefutable documentation of Leora's character and motivations. The calligrapher, a woman of advanced years who had spent her lifetime executing commissions for persons of the highest standing, undertook the work with meticulous attention to detail. She reproduced not merely the words, but the slight variations in handwriting that suggested Leora's emotional state at the moment of composition, the smudges that indicated moments where her pen had hesitated, the corrections that demonstrated her careful consideration of language. When the transcription was complete, Corvin presented it to Leora in the library of Aldridge House, the same library where he had retired to read the original letter in the chapel's immediate aftermath. The document was contained in a leather portfolio of exceptional quality, and the pages themselves were of the finest vellum, executed in an ink of deep blue that seemed to possess luminosity in certain light. "I have had this commissioned," Corvin explained, "not as a mere duplication but as a testament. This transcription will reside in the archives of Aldridge House, and it will serve as historical documentation for all future generations regarding the circumstances of your disappearance and your return. The original will be sealed and preserved, but this version will be available for any future inquiry that might require knowledge of the truth." Leora accepted the portfolio with a hand that trembled slightly, and as she read through the transcription, she found herself experiencing emotion that was neither entirely grief nor entirely joy, but some admixture of both that seemed to encompass the totality of her experience over the preceding months. "Your Grace," she said at last, "by creating this transcription and placing it in the permanent records of Aldridge House, you have accomplished something far more significant than mere documentation. You have ensured that my story, my truth, will be preserved and available to future generations as an alternative narrative to whatever stories society might construct." "That is precisely my intention," Corvin confirmed. "Furthermore, I have conceived another notion, and I should like to present it to you for your consideration." He moved to the window of the library, gesturing for her to join him. From this vantage point, one could perceive the entirety of the Aldridge Botanical Gardens, the carefully cultivated spaces that her father had helped to design, the conservation structures that housed rare specimens, the pathways that wound through compositions of extraordinary horticultural achievement. "I should like to establish a scholarship in your father's name," Corvin said quietly. "A scholarship that would provide resources for young people of modest circumstances who demonstrate exceptional aptitude in the botanical sciences. The program would bear his name, would include within its founding documents acknowledgement of the work he accomplished, and would ensure that his legacy extends far beyond what mere mortality might otherwise permit." "Your Grace," Leora said, and her voice carried such emotion that she seemed barely capable of articulation, "you are offering me the restoration of my father's memory and reputation?" "I am offering nothing that was not always rightfully his," Corvin replied. "Your father was a man of genuine scientific accomplishment, whose work was recognized by the most distinguished members of the botanical community. That recognition was overshadowed by the scandal surrounding your departure, yet the work itself remains as significant as ever. I am merely ensuring that future generations will know him as he deserved to be known, as a man of learning and integrity whose contributions to the advancement of knowledge remain undiminished by the vicissitudes of social fortune. Leora turned to face him, and in her expression there was a combination of gratitude and something approaching overwhelming emotion. "When I departed London," she said quietly, "I did so believing that I was sacrificing everything for the sake of protecting you and preserving my father's memory as best I could through silence and absence. Yet what you have just offered me suggests that truth need not require such sacrifice, that honor can be preserved through action and through the creation of permanent testimony regarding the facts of our lives." She moved closer to him, and her voice dropped to something approaching a whisper. "You have transformed my departure from an act of tragic necessity into something approaching triumph. You have taken what was meant to be an ending and transformed it into a foundation upon which something enduring might be constructed." Corvin's hands rose to frame her face with extraordinary gentleness, and for a moment they simply stood before one another, separated by the smallest distance, yet connected by threads of understanding and regard that transcended the physical. "Miss Leora," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, "you have been the architect of your own redemption. I have merely been a witness to your remarkable journey, and I have attempted to ensure that your courage receives the acknowledgement that it deserves. The remainder, the testimony, the scholarship, the preservation of truth, these are merely expressions of what was always true regarding your character." Winter had surrendered to the tentative emergence of spring, and with it came a transformation in the social landscape that seemed to mirror the transformation occurring within the hearts of those most intimately connected to the narrative of Leora's return. The botanical gardens of Aldridge House had burst into bloom, a profusion of color and fragrance that suggested renewal and the possibility of beauty arising from what had previously seemed barren. It was during this season that Corvin formally requested permission from Leora to approach her with an official proposal of marriage. The request itself, conducted with all the ceremonial propriety that such a significant moment demanded, took place not in the drawing room nor in any location of ordinary domesticity, but rather in the botanical gardens themselves, surrounded by the living testimony to her father's horticultural vision. Corvin had arranged for the pathway that led through the most exquisite section of the gardens to be lined with white flowers, lilies and roses identical to those that had filled the chapel during that extraordinary memorial service months previous. Yet these flowers carried a different meaning. Whereas those had symbolized mourning and absence, these symbolized return and the possibility of union. Leora walked the pathway with Mirabelle, who had been informed of the intended proposal, and who carried within her expression the joy of one who had witnessed the redemption of a beloved friend. At the center of the pathway stood Corvin, dressed not in the dark, formal attire of society, but in something simpler, clothing that suggested a man stepping away from the demands of aristocratic performance and standing before another human being as he truly was. "Miss Leora," he began, and his voice carried no trace of the ceremonial formality that might have been expected. Instead, there was in his tone an intimacy that suggested he was speaking not to an audience, but to a single soul who held the entirety of his consciousness. "I have spent the months since your reappearance engaged in profound contemplation of what your return means, not merely to myself, but to the broader narrative of my existence. I have come to understand that life itself, the genuine, authentic experience of existence, had been suspended in the moment of your departure, and that it resumed only upon the moment of your return." He withdrew a small box from his waistcoat pocket, and as he opened it, the afternoon light caught upon a ring of extraordinary beauty. The band was of white gold, and set within it was not a conventional diamond, but rather a stone of the palest blue, a sapphire of such delicate hue that it seemed almost to partake of the color of water or of sky. "This stone," he explained, "was chosen for its resemblance to the color of your eyes in certain light, that pearlescent gray-blue that seems to contain within itself a quality of luminosity. It is set in white gold rather than the conventional yellow, for I wished the design to suggest something approaching moonlight rather than mere material wealth." He extended the ring toward her, and in his entire bearing there was a vulnerability that seemed to strip away every protective layer he had ever constructed. "Miss Leora Crestwell," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity, "I am asking you to consent to become my wife, not as a gesture toward society, not as a resolution of scandal, not as a fulfillment of obligation, but as the expression of my own deepest truth. I am asking you to permit me to spend the remainder of my existence in proximity to your extraordinary character and to allow me the privilege of witnessing the unfolding of your remarkable journey." Leora's hand rose to her mouth in an expression of emotion too profound for immediate articulation. Tears traced a path down her cheeks, yet her expression carried not sadness, but rather a joy so complete that it seemed to encompass the entirety of her being. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice trembled with the weight of response, "I accept your proposal. I accept it with full consciousness of what marriage to you will entail, the continued scrutiny of society, the burden of proving my worth through every action, the responsibility of upholding the dignity of your name and station. I accept it because I have come to understand that you have offered me something far more precious than mere social elevation. You have offered me the validation of my own character, the acknowledgement of my own truth, and the possibility of a future in which I need not hide any aspect of my authentic self." She extended her hand, and as Corvin placed the ring upon her finger, something seemed to shift in the very fabric of the spring afternoon. The birds seemed to sing with greater intensity, the flowers seemed to bloom with more vibrant color, and the light itself seemed to acquire a quality of benediction. Mirabelle stepped forward and embraced them both, her own tears mingling with expressions of unrestrained joy. "You have done it," she whispered to Leora. "You have transformed tragedy into triumph, and you have done so through the simple assertion of your own truth." Word of the engagement spread through society with remarkable rapidity, and in the days that followed, the response was overwhelmingly one of approval and celebration. Even Lady Meridia, recognizing that her position had become entirely untenable, withdrew from society with a grace that suggested some belated acknowledgement of her own misjudgment, though she never publicly acknowledged the necessity of such withdrawal. The engagement period stretched across several months, during which time Corvin and Leora prepared not merely for a wedding, but for a life together that was grounded in absolute authenticity and mutual respect. There were no pretenses, no careful performances, no guardedness between them. Instead, there was an openness that seemed to sanctify every moment of their interaction. The wedding itself, to be conducted in the chapel where Leora had made her extraordinary reappearance, was being planned with meticulous attention to detail, yet neither Leora nor Corvin regarded the ceremony itself as the culmination of their journey. They regarded it, instead, as merely a public acknowledgement of a truth that had been established in the months preceding, the truth that two souls had recognized in one another something approaching completion, and that they had chosen to construct a life together based not on social necessity, but on the profound recognition of mutual worth. The day before the wedding, the chapel at Aldridge stood in a state of careful preparation. Flowers, white lilies, cream roses, and delicate lavender blooms had been arranged in every corner, transforming the sacred space into something approaching a garden itself. The light filtered through the tall windows in the particular manner of late spring, creating an atmosphere of such luminosity that it seemed almost to sanctify the space through the simple operation of natural illumination. Leora stood in the anteroom adjacent to the chapel, dressed not in her wedding attire, which remained carefully preserved in her chambers, but in a simple gown of pale grey muslin. Mirabelle was present, along with a small group of trusted attendants, but the primary focus of attention was upon a moment that Leora had specifically requested, an opportunity to stand alone in the chapel before the ceremony that would permanently alter her place within society and within the life of the Duke of Aldridge. As she entered the chapel, the quietness of the space seemed almost to embrace her. The flowers released their fragrance into the still air, and the light from the windows created patterns of extraordinary beauty upon the stone floor. She moved toward the altar, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. "I have returned," she whispered, and her voice seemed to carry within it the accumulated weight of all that had transpired since her departure and her extraordinary reappearance. "I have returned not as a ghost haunting the place of my own memorial, but as a living woman who has reclaimed her own narrative and who has discovered that truth, however costly in its pursuit, provides foundation for something enduring." She stood before the altar where only months previous she had appeared as a phantom to disrupt the proceedings of her own funeral. Yet now, in the quietness of the space, surrounded by the evidence of renewal and growth, she found herself in a state of profound peace. The doors of the chapel opened, and Corvin entered, not dressed in his formal wedding attire, but in simple dark clothing that suggested a man stepping away from social performance and approaching sacred vulnerability. He moved toward her with a deliberation that spoke of profound purpose. "I was not aware that you had requested this private moment," he said softly, and there was in his voice no accusation, merely observation. "Yet I confess that I felt compelled to seek you out. I found myself unable to remain away from your presence, even for the brief hours that remain before we stand before the assembled company and formally pledge ourselves to one another." Leora turned to face him, and in the light from the chapel windows, her expression seemed to carry an almost luminous quality. "I wanted to stand in this place," she said quietly, "to acknowledge the extraordinary journey that has brought us to this juncture. I wanted to speak aloud the gratitude that I feel for the courage you have demonstrated in choosing me, despite the complications that such a choice entails." Corvin moved toward her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quality of absolute conviction. "Miss Leora, you remain under the impression that I have demonstrated courage in choosing you. Yet what I perceive is precisely the reverse. It is you who have demonstrated the extraordinary courage, the courage to speak truth when silence would have been easier, the courage to return when remaining away would have been safer, the courage to permit yourself to be loved by a man whose station might have seemed to offer merely material advantage rather than genuine affection." He took her hands within his own, and the contact seemed to carry within it a benediction. "What I have done is merely acknowledge a truth that was evident to anyone possessed of eyes sufficient to perceive it, that you are a woman of exceptional character, and that the gift of your love is one of the most precious things that the world has to offer." They stood together in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the fragrance of flowers and the subtle testimony of light. In that silence, there seemed to be a communion that transcended words, an understanding between two souls who had journeyed through darkness and had emerged into illumination. "Tomorrow," Leora said at last, "we stand before society and pledge ourselves to one another. Yet I want you to understand that those pledges have already been made, not in words or ceremonies, but in the accumulated moments of trust and vulnerability and authentic connection that we have shared. Tomorrow's ceremony is merely the public acknowledgement of promises that were established in the quietness of drawing rooms and in the solitude of letters, and in the extraordinary moment when I appeared at my own memorial and spoke truth to the man who had been bearing the burden of false guilt." "I understand," Corvin replied, and his voice carried such absolute sincerity that it seemed to carry within it the weight of sacred vow. "And I am grateful, not merely for your love, but for your insistence upon authenticity, for your refusal to permit either of us to retreat into comfortable performance, and for your courage in choosing to stand beside me as we face whatever challenges the future may present." They remained together in the chapel as the evening light shifted and changed, two souls standing before the altar where, on the following day, they would formally pledge themselves to one another before all of society. Yet in that moment of private communion, it seemed that the most sacred vows had already been spoken, not in words, but in the simple act of being present to one another, of acknowledging truth, and of choosing love despite the costs that such choice entails. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clarity of light that suggested the entire world had been washed clean by some divine intervention. The spring sun poured through the tall windows of Aldridge House, illuminating the spaces with a radiance that seemed almost to sanctify every surface it touched. Leora stood in her chambers, the chambers that would after today become shared spaces with Corvin, and gazed upon her reflection in the mirror with an expression that combined nervousness, joy, and the profound certainty of one who is stepping into the life they have always known, on some fundamental level, that they were meant to inhabit. Her wedding gown had been created by the most renowned dressmaker in London, yet the design itself had emerged from collaboration between Leora and the artisan, a collaboration that had ensured the final creation reflected not merely fashion, but the authentic expression of Leora's character and aesthetic sensibility. The gown was fashioned of the finest silk, in a pale silver that seemed almost to glow with inner light. The sleeves were modest, cut to suggest elegance rather than revelation, and the bodice was adorned with delicate embroidery that featured botanical motifs, a subtle homage to her father's life work, and to the gardens that had been the setting for Corvin's proposal. Her veil was of the most exquisite Brussels lace, and rather than covering her face entirely, it had been arranged to frame her features in a manner that suggested transparency rather than concealment. At the base of the veil, secured with a comb fashioned of silver and set with tiny sapphires, was a single white lily, identical to the flowers that had lined the pathway through the botanical gardens on the day of her engagement. Mirabelle entered the chambers with an expression of such complete joy that it seemed to illuminate the space more effectively than the morning sunlight. "Oh, Leora," she said, and her voice carried the weight of years of friendship and of having witnessed the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "You are radiant. You are entirely and absolutely radiant." "I am terrified," Leora replied, though her smile suggested that the terror was not of an unpleasant variety. Yet the terror is accompanied by a joy so complete that it seems almost to transcend the boundaries of ordinary emotional experience. "That is precisely the condition one should feel on the eve of such a profound commitment," Mirabelle observed, moving to adjust the placement of the veil. "To feel nothing but joy would suggest that one had not contemplated the magnitude of what one is undertaking. To feel only terror would suggest that one was stepping towards something one did not genuinely desire. But to feel both, to feel joy and terror in equal measure, that suggests one is about to step into a life that is both challenging and worthy of the challenge." The servants of Aldridge House moved through the corridors, ensuring that every preparation had been completed according to plan. The chapel had been arranged with such extraordinary care that it bore almost no resemblance to the space in which Leora had made her dramatic reappearance months previous. Yet for both Leora and Corvin, that chapel would forever carry the memory of that extraordinary moment, the moment when she had emerged from shadows and had begun the process of reclaiming her own narrative. As Leora descended the grand staircase of Aldridge House, supported by the arm of Lord Harrington, who had proven to be a faithful advocate and who would serve as her escort in the absence of a living father, she found herself reflecting upon the journey that had brought her to this juncture. She thought of the months of separation, of the labor in the Kent household, of the careful economies that had permitted her to restore her father's finances, of the quiet determination that had sustained her through darkness and uncertainty. Yet she thought also of the letter, that precious communication that had contained within it the seeds of her own redemption, the letter that had been carefully preserved, transcribed, and placed in the permanent archives of Aldridge House, the letter that would, for generations to come, serve as testimony to the power of truth spoken with courage and grace. The chapel was filled with members of society, those who had chosen to support the union, and those who had been compelled by social necessity to attend. But as Leora entered the sacred space, moving toward the altar where Corvin awaited her, she found that she perceived only one individual, only the man whose regard had transformed her understanding of what love might signify, whose courage in publicly choosing her had provided her with the foundation necessary to reclaim her own worth. Corvin stood at the altar dressed in formal, dark attire, yet his attention was entirely focused upon her approach. As their eyes met across the distance that separated them, something seemed to shift in the very foundation of reality, a recognition of two souls who had journeyed through separation and darkness and who were now stepping into illumination together. The Reverend Ashford conducted the ceremony with all the solemnity and grace that such a significant union demanded. Yet the most powerful moment did not occur during the exchange of rings or during the formal pronouncements that transformed them from separate individuals into a married couple. Instead, it occurred in the moment after the ceremony had concluded, when Corvin reached for Leora's hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture of such tenderness that even those members of society who had harbored doubts regarding the union found themselves moved to recognition of the authenticity of his regard. As they processed from the chapel, the assembled company rose to offer their acknowledgement, not with the perfunctory applause that might be offered at any fashionable wedding, but with something approaching genuine celebration. The narrative that Leora had so carefully constructed, the truth that she had so courageously spoken, the transformation that she had so deliberately engineered, all of these seemed to crystallize in that moment into a recognition that here, before them, stood a woman who had reclaimed her own story, and a man who had possessed the wisdom and the courage to recognize her extraordinary worth. In the months and years that followed, Leora became known throughout society not as the woman who had mysteriously disappeared, but as the Duchess of Aldridge, a woman of exceptional cultivation, profound intelligence, and a commitment to social good that expressed itself through the advancement of botanical science and the education of young people of modest circumstances. The scholarship established in her father's name became one of the most prestigious in England, attracting students from throughout the world and serving as a living testimony to the power of knowledge and the possibility of transcending the limitations that circumstance attempts to impose upon us. Yet for Leora and Corvin themselves, The true measure of their union was not to be found in society's acknowledgement or in the institutions they established together. It was to be found in the quiet moments, in the hours spent walking through the botanical gardens that her father had helped to design, in the conversations conducted in the library where Corvin had first read her letter, in the simple act of being present to one another without pretense or performance. And in those quiet moments, surrounded by the testimony of growth and renewal, they seemed to understand that the most profound victories are not those that occur in public spaces before assembled witnesses, but rather those that occur in the private chambers of the heart, victories of authentic connection, of courage sustained through darkness, of the recognition that love itself is the greatest form of truth, and that truth, however costly in its pursuit, provides foundation for something enduring, something approaching eternal, something worthy of the extraordinary sacrifices that its achievement demands. The narrative of Leora and Corvin speaks to a truth that lies at the heart of human experience, a truth that transcends the particular circumstances of aristocratic society and speaks to the universal condition of those who find themselves torn between the demands of social performance and the authenticity of genuine feeling. The story suggests that silence, however well-intentioned, carries within it a capacity to destroy far more profoundly than any explicit confession might accomplish. When we choose to protect others through the concealment of truth, when we sacrifice our own authenticity in service to what we perceive as their greater good, we often fail to recognize that such sacrifice denies those we seek to protect the opportunity to respond to us as fully realized human beings. Moreover, the story demonstrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the presence of conviction sufficiently powerful to sustain us through fear. Leora's return to London, her decision to speak truth before an assembled company, her willingness to permit herself to be loved despite the risks that such love entailed, all of these were acts undertaken not in the absence of terror, but in the presence of understanding that authenticity, however costly, provides the only possible foundation for a life that is truly worth living. The narrative suggests further that redemption is not something that is granted to us by society or by those whom we have wronged. Rather, redemption is something that we accomplish for ourselves through the accumulation of authentic actions, through the patient assertion of truth, and through the cultivation of virtue in circumstances where virtue is neither easy nor particularly rewarded by the immediate environment. Leora did not seek validation from society. She sought only to restore truth and to permit those who cared for her to understand her actual circumstances, rather than to remain bound by assumption and conjecture. Perhaps most profoundly, the story speaks to the transformative power of being truly seen and authentically acknowledged by another human being. Corvin's recognition of Leora's character, his public commitment to her despite the complications that such commitment entailed, his consistent assertion that her worth transcended the judgments that society attempted to impose upon her, these actions provided Leora with the foundation necessary to truly claim her own worth. And in return, Leora's authenticity provided Corvin with permission to step away from the carefully constructed persona of the Duke of Aldridge and to embrace his full humanity. In a world that constantly demands performance, that continuously insists that we present versions of ourselves that are socially acceptable rather than genuinely authentic, the story of Leora and Corvin offers a quiet but persistent assertion that there exists another way, a way of radical honesty, of vulnerability deliberately chosen, of truth spoken with courage and received with grace. It suggests that the most powerful love is not that which overcomes obstacles through force or manipulation, but rather that which acknowledges truth with such clarity and courage that obstacles seem to dissolve in its presence. Dear beloved listeners, if this story has moved your heart, if you have found within it resonance with your own experience of seeking authenticity in a world that constantly demands performance, we invite you most warmly to join our community at Victorian Romance Audio Stories. Subscribe to our channel to ensure that you do not miss future narratives of love, courage, and the triumph of truth over convenience. Leave your comments below. Tell us which moment in Leora's journey spoke most profoundly to your own heart. Share your reflections on the power of authenticity, or simply let us know how this story has affected you. Your engagement sustains our mission to bring these narratives of emotional truth and historical romance to audiences throughout the world. We read every comment with genuine interest and gratitude, and we cherish the opportunity to build community with those who understand the transformative power of stories told with maestria and riqueza de detalles, with mastery and richness of detail. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we extend our deepest gratitude for the time you have devoted to accompanying Leora and Corvin through their extraordinary journey. We are profoundly honored that you have permitted us to share this narrative of courage, authenticity, and the transformative power of love with you. We recognize that in choosing to listen to our story, you have offered us a gift of considerable value. Your attention, your emotional engagement, and your willingness to permit yourself to be moved by the experiences of characters who, though fictional, speak to truths that are wholly real and universally resonant. We hope that this story has provided not merely entertainment, but also a moment of reflection regarding the power of truth, the courage that authenticity demands, and the possibility of redemption through the simple but profound act of being genuinely seen and appreciated by another soul. We invite you to return to our channel for future narratives, and we pledge to you that each story we create will be crafted with the same commitment to emotional truth, historical authenticity, and narrative artistry that you have experienced in She Appeared at Her Own Memorial, and the Duke Fell Silent When She Spoke the Truth He Feared. With deep gratitude and warm regards, the team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories.